Now, what this new movement is about using private power to accomplish through the private sector what government could not do through the front door. What are they getting in return? That is the question we need to be asking.
At the 2022 Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, I sit down with entrepreneur and commentator Vivek Ramaswamy, founder of a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company and author of Woke Inc., inside corporate America's social justice scam.
That's created a new managerial class in our country that's actually running the show, not the people and the puppets we elect to run the government.
Tonight, he breaks down his vision of how Americans can ultimately force large corporations to abandon woke ideology.
It is time, as I say, to reset the Great Reset.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kalik.
Vivek Ramaswamy, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
It's good to be back.
Well, so it's been probably about half a year since we talked about Woke Inc. when the book came out. And I remember thinking, wow, this is a really important addition to the picture of how this woke, what you describe as a woke religion, frankly, many people, John McWhorter, others describe as religion, is taking shape in America, the corporate aspect. How is this such an important part of what large American corporations, not just American, internationally, are doing today? So where are we at here?
So where we are is that people have begun to see what's going on. And I think we're ready for a counter movement. The question is what way we channel the counter movement, in a productive direction or in a direction that actually further divides the economy into two economies like the rest of our culture. At a high level, that's where we're at. Now, just to sort of pick up where we last left off and how we got here first. Look, I think that this new woke part of woke capitalism represents a new currency. It is a new currency through which crony capitalism works. What do I mean by that? Well, back in the early 2000s, the ways that companies exercised governmental influence to gain competitive advantages in return was through dollars. They wrote checks through the front door, campaign contributions, they reported them, hired the lobbyists, did it the old-fashioned way. What you've now seen is a new left post-Citizens United that emerged and said that we're skeptical of those kinds of donations and wielding influence that way. So corporate America got smart. And what they decided was, actually, if you're Goldman Sachs, instead of writing the check, instead of appointing even your alumnus as Treasury Secretary or whatever it is they used to do, now we tithe to the new temple in a new currency by declaring that they won't take a company public in the United States unless its board is sufficiently diverse, as determined by the combination of Goldman Sachs and the neo-progressive left. When do they do that? When Elizabeth Warren is the front runner in the Democratic primary, when she says she wouldn't accept corporate campaign contributions. So this is a new currency is what it's become. And that creates this new version of an arranged marriage between big business and the woke left that used to represent the threat to big business. What big business realized is they could defang the left by bringing them along for the ride. And that's actually created a new mechanism for the left to effectuate its agenda, not through someone they love. This is not a marriage of love. It's mutual prostitution, let's call it what it is, but has recognized that the person they're hired to provide their services, corporate America, has actually been able to be a more effective vehicle for advancing their agenda than even government itself. So that's how we got to where we are. Now, I think moments like this at CPAC, that only the conservative base, but I would say a grassroots populist uprising across the political spectrum has recognized that that's created a new managerial class in our country that's actually running the show, not the people and the puppets we elect to run the government. The people we elect to run the government aren't actually running the government. It's a bunch of other people who are appointed classes of leaders in the private and public sectors that together represent this managerial layer that's actually running the show. People are beginning to wake up to it. Truckers in Canada are beginning to wake up to it. Their counterparts in democracies in the abroad, like the United States or Western Europe or Australia or even India, are waking up to it. And now that brings me back to the first point I made, which is how do we channel that energy? Do we channel it in a way that actually drives positive change and gets something done politically and in our private sector? Or do we channel it in a way that really takes us to to a point of even greater fissure and greater division? I'm focused on making sure, I think that's a good energy, but it needs to be channeled in a direction that drives positive change. That's what I'm focused on.
Okay, that's super interesting. So the kind of movement you're describing, to some extent, it actually reminds me a bit of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was a left, that was a more left movement, but it wasn't entirely a left movement. There were Tea Party type people involved. They were basically people who are against massive corporate overreach, which would be in my mind, precisely the kinds of people that the corporations would be interested in somehow like nullifying, get rid of your voice. So is there any connection to this whole Occupy Wall Street and how it suddenly kind of got snuffed out at some point?
It's a great question, Jan. So I think that you're really onto something here. The Occupy Wall Street movement represented a threat to Wall Street. If you're Wall Street, you don't like Occupy Wall Street very much. That's why they used the woke movement, born in the post-2008 era, to defang Occupy Wall Street, to say that actually the real problem isn't economic injustice, as Occupy Wall Street called for. It really wasn't those government bailouts of the big banks, of bankers who made a ton of money when time was good and got bailed out by the public when times was bad. That wasn't the real problem, no. It was systemic racism and misogyny and bigotry. And we'll talk about systemic racism all day long as you don't make us talk about systemic financial risk. And actually, that's ultimately how you had this new marriage of woke millennials together getting in bed with big banks, together birthing woke capitalism, and using that to put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. So they blew woke smoke to deflect accountability of the kind that the Occupy Wall Street movement wanted to bring to bear. Now, that woke smoke has begun to clear, people are seeing a clear picture again. It's still the same managerial class that's in charge. And this is not a left-wing point or a right-wing point. It is a point about restoring the voices of everyday Americans and everyday citizens of democracies around the world, including Canada, including in Western Europe, who are saying that, okay, woke stuff aside, maybe some of us got distracted by that along the way, the ones on the left, but even they're coming back, and the ones on the right certainly weren't distracted by it at any point along the way, to say that, okay, but at the end of the day, how are our voices being represented in the governments that we're supposedly participants in as citizens, in the institutions that we're supposedly part of as shareholders and as workers? And we still demand answers to those questions. That's what we're beginning to see is a modern version of that Tea Party a decade later, asking the questions of the institutions that they're a part of to say that how are our voices actually represented? And this time, I think we're past the woke smoke offering a sufficient distraction. Mark my words, they're going to offer other distractions through the temple of scientism, which appeals to scientific authority as it relates to COVID-19 or something else to try to deflect attention. But I think that those deflection strategies are wearing thin. Things are coming to a head where we're going to have to decide at the end of the day, do we actually live in a democracy where the people who we elect to run the government, be they Democrats or Republicans or whoever, are the people who we elect to run the government the people who actually run the government? Or are they going to be these managerial bureaucrats, both in the private sector and the alphabet soup of the public sector, the FTC, the SEC, the FDA, the FBI, and the alphabet soup of the private sector, the MSFT, the AMCN, the FB, and the GOOG? Are they the ones who are in charge of our democracy? Or is it going to be the people who we actually elect to run the government? That's the question that I think people on the left and the right are asking. And this is coming to a head in the next 3 years as we determine the answer to that question of whether we live in a modern monarchy in American soil, or do we actually live in the democracy that defected from the old world way of a small group of managerial elites telling the rest of society how to live? That's the question of our time.
So monarchy, oligarchy, I guess, that's like kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. I'm going to use monarchy, lowercase m, monarchy. But we live in a monarchical society where a combination of corporate kings and bureaucratic kings that constitute the same people, by the way, who occupy corporate boards of directors, who become ambassadors abroad, who become associate deans of universities. It's the same people.
They call it a revolving door, right?
They call it a revolving door, but it's really kind of a horizontal, let's just say, flow of the same type of managerial elites that are crushing the will of everyday people, who, be they consumers in the private sector, be they students in the university, be they citizens in a democracy. And the moment we live in is, are we ultimately going to be a society governed by we the people, or are we going to be a society governed by the managerial elites? And this is not a right-wing issue. It's not a left-wing issue. It is an issue that I think actually both parties are going to need to grapple with, and this is coming to a head in the next few years.
Well, it's really interesting because I'm just remembering a chat I had with Batya Ungar-Sargon. Like, her perspective is that this whole woke thing, it's actually, and this is frankly, I think what you're describing, it's a kind of a class war masquerading as a kind of identity war or a cultural war. Right? Does that ring a bell?
It does. I mean, I think that the use of identity politics as a deflection from the class discussion, I think, is something that the left should actually be incensed about. I'm not a big class warfare guy myself, actually, and I'm a conservative. We can talk about what underpins that worldview. But this is a different point, is that I actually would rather have a robust, intellectually well-grounded left that talked about economic class, because at least that's a universalist vision. You could be rich or poor, whether you're gay or straight, black or white, or Democrat or Republican, for that matter, or man or woman, for that matter. And they have deflected the discussion away from economic class to being about this modern group identity-based disempowerment narrative that says that you're nothing more than the characteristics you inherit on the day you're born that determine who you are and what you can become. That is actually far more toxic and far more divisive. And I think that it's a good deflection mechanism, but a consequence of that deflection is that it has left us more divided as people in the end. The good news is, and you know, she's done great work. You know, I've written my book. A lot of people have been focused on these issues over the last few years. That I think we've actually passed the peak woke moment. So wokeism's ability to today serve as the deflection tactic that it has for the last 5 to 6 years, that moment has slowly passed. And I think that's good news, because it's going to force us to answer the hard questions underneath it of whether the managerial elites that were using it as a deflection tactic are really the people we want to have in charge or not. That's the conversation we need to have.
Well, and so all these companies now, I mean, I'm personally aware of a number of even people that are kind of involved with this directly. There's these, I mean, it's been described as DEI commissars, right? That basically, you know, end up having this kind of, I mean, very real power to influence both how everybody needs to be educated to be acceptable to be in the company. And of course, it's around woke principles and so forth. And also like who gets hired, who doesn't get hired, is your pedigree, you know, is there anything in here that might suggest that you might not be woke enough? I mean, these structures now exist in, is it every major company? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's most major companies. It's part of what I call deep corporate. It's the counterpart to the deep state. It's the managerial bureaucracy that actually was set up to administer, I use that in quotes, the civil rights statutes. So the civil rights statute said you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race, sex, religion, or national origin. As of last year, the Supreme Court read sexual orientation into sex. But they created a bureaucracy that, on the back of a lot of case law and jurisprudence, that begin to say that actually any disparate impact on one of those tectonic group identity plates, any disparate impact to a racial group or whatever, could be a basis for inferring discrimination. So what does that create is a bureaucracy to administer so-called anti-racism, the woke agenda, that ironically created the very conditions for rampant political discrimination that we see in those very institutions, while leaving political discrimination unprotected as a civil right. So what I actually say is, to these DEI initiatives that are actually a response to the lineage of the civil rights statutes, you can't have it both ways, okay? Either we make political belief a civil right in this country, just like race, sex, religion, and national origin and sexual orientation, to say you can't fire somebody or deplatform somebody for that matter because they're black or gay or Muslim or white or Christian or Jewish or whatever. You also can't fire somebody or deplatform somebody just because they're an outspoken conservative either. And maybe the free market can work this out and we get rid of protected classes altogether, or we have the protected classes, but we apply the standards even-handedly. But we cannot create the conditions for political discrimination while leaving political belief unprotected. So that's a big part of one of the solutions that I see to this problem. You know, not all the solutions are through politics and policy, but that is one that's through policy that can create the conditions for, I think, a robust private sector that doesn't use the bureaucracies of DEI and the deep corporate apparatus to create the conditions for political discrimination that we see today.
Well, and just very briefly, you know, you've kind of been able to explain what this whole DEI system really means, because it sounds good. Diversity, equity, inclusion.
Yeah.
Equity kind of sounds like equality. We know it's not. But can you give us like a super quick overview of what this means? Yeah,
it's a secular religion, which what it's managed to do is a bit of what Fyodor Dostoevsky had in mind when he wrote the story of the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov, where it was the chapter where Christ is back in earth in the middle of the Spanish Inquisition, walking the streets of Seville. And the Grand Inquisitor, the head of the church in Spain, spots him and has Christ arrested. And the peak of the chapter is the dialogue between Christ and the Grand Inquisitor, where the Grand Inquisitor tells him that we, the church, don't need you, Christ, anymore. In fact, your presence here impedes our work, and that's why we're going to sentence you to death. That's what the Church of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion has done. In the name of diversity, we have actually sentenced true diversity of thought to death. You can't say certain things in a diversity, equity, inclusion-based environment. In the name of equity, we've actually sacrificed true equality of opportunity, where you don't discriminate against somebody on account of their race or their sex or their religion or their national origin. In the name of inclusion, we've created this exclusive culture where certain points of view just aren't welcome. So it's a religion where in the name of those values, it's actually held those very values hostage and sentenced them to death, much as Dostoevsky envisioned at the time he wrote centuries ago. And so I think that that's what's going on in corporate America today. I think that there's an opportunity, however, and it's not just through politics. I talked about making political belief a civil right. I write about that in my book. I talked about it, earlier this morning to a group here at CPAC. However, I think there's an even bigger opportunity through the front door of the market. What do I mean by that? The front door of the market itself, exactly. It's a wide open opportunity for entrepreneurs who want to step up and capture it. Here's the opportunity. Because of the DEI agenda in corporate America and elsewhere, there are over 100 million Americans today. And by the way, their counterparts abroad in countries like Canada, in Western Europe, in France, in England, in Australia, even in India, who are put off by the places where they shop, where they bank, where they invest, where they work, who've said they've actually had enough of this new culture of exclusion in the name of capital I inclusion. And what they're saying is that, you know what? We want alternatives. We don't want, cheap, reactionary right-wing alternatives. No, we want robust, universalist American alternatives that stand for example, the unapologetic pursuit of excellence. And you know what? I don't want a right-wing alternative, but I do want companies that tell me that the American dream is alive and well, that capitalism is the best system known to mankind to lift people up from poverty. It's not a racist system, and we will not apologize for it with three-letter acronyms. And that, you know what, you should be able to free to speak your mind without fear of putting food on the dinner table, because America is that country that allows you to enjoy both of those freedoms at once. That's what this new movement stands for, is unapologetically pursuing excellence. To say that, yeah, diversity might be a great thing, but it is a means towards the end of pursuing excellence. It is not an end in itself. And to say that actually that's how we're coming to market with consumer products, with financial products, with social media and technology products, and say that that's what we stand for in what I call, Jan, the excellence economy, which is different from the ESG economy, which is different from the DEI economy, which is different from the Great Reset economy. It's an excellence economy, an economy centered on the pursuit of American excellence and excellence in other countries as well. That, you know what, here's the business part of this. The customers who find those messages resonant happen to be the best customers of any business. They're net savers, they're hard workers, they don't lie on their insurance or their credit card applications. They're loyal customers with a lot of buying power that comprises, I think, the fourth largest economy in the world if you just count the Americans, and I think it's the largest economy in the world if it comprises the equivalent consumers and citizens in other countries. And so I want to see a parallel cultural movement and economic movement that reaches out to those consumers, just as I want to see new conservative leaders reach out to those citizens to say that actually we're giving the voice of the people back, both with their first vote, with their votes at the ballot box, as well as with their second vote, with the pocketbook dollars and their investment dollars and their buying dollars, to say that actually we the people do deserve to be heard. But we're not going to do it with a grievance culture. We're going to do it by actually exercising our voices, our buying power, our consuming power, to say that we deserve to be respected. And that's an opportunity for CEOs and businesses and entrepreneurs who today are brave enough to capture it. Now, the first movers are going to have to be pretty brave, because that hasn't been done yet in a high quality way. But guess what? The market rewards those who are bravest first. And it's actually a value investing principle, timeless, in the words of Warren Buffett, for that matter, who famously said, actually, markets reward those who are fearful when others are brave. It also rewards those who are brave when others are fearful. And I think this is a moment for those who are brave when others are fearful to reap the rewards of actually their courage.